Hello, everyone. I'm sitting in my dark closet. I have a question for you. Are you afraid of the dark? I promised a ghost story because you asked for one, so here's a new one. Parents, if you're watching, don't worry. It's not too terrifying. Many, many years ago, there was an expensive school in Ohio that all the richest parents paid to send their students. But because it was so expensive, the teacher, Mr. Smith, wanted to bring all of the students on a yearly camping trip. He always did this over the summer. Well, he had a delightful class, except for one student named Stanley Jenkins. No matter how many times Mr. Smith told Stanley to listen, Stanley did whatever he wanted. Mr. Smith was frustrated, but he was a nice teacher, so he decided to bring Stanley on the trip anyway. Well, as they went out to the countryside, they started pitching their tents and getting ready for the camp out. Stanley and his friends, as usual, sat in a circle, being lazy, doing nothing to help the rest of the students and the teacher, Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith reminded him, Stanley, if you don't help, bad things might happen. But do you think Stanley listened? No, he did not, and he encouraged other people to sit and be lazy with him. Well, as Mr. Smith gathered the rest of the kids around, Stanley and his friends finally joined them. Mr. Smith told them about all the fun that they would have, but he gave them a strict rule. He said across the field there's an old farmhouse and an old farm field that's surrounded by a fence, and in that fence there's a well. We're not allowed to go there. We can't go there. Well, the rest of the students were kind of confused. Why would Mr. Smith say that? Is it really that dangerous to go in an old farm field with an old well? Whatever. Now, if you know anything about Stanley Jenkins, you know exactly what he's thinking. Well, later that day, Stanley and his friends snuck off to go explore the countryside. They went to the top of a hill, and they could see down below. They could see the farm field, and they could see the old well. They began to hear a rattling in the bushes. Ah! What's there? They said. And they turned around to see an old farmer and his dog. And they said, Sir, what are you doing here? And the farmer replied in an old, crackly voice, Boys, what are you doing up here looking at the field? And the boys responded, We were just looking, sir. Our teacher, Mr. Smith, told us not to go down in the field, so we were just looking. And the farmer replied, That's good, because that old wishing well, that's nothing but trouble. You should stay away from there. I'm glad your teacher told you. Now, the boys were terrified, all except for Stanley Jenkins. So Stanley got all rude and spoke up and said, Sir, what's so dangerous about a well? Will it, give us wishes if we throw some coins in it? And the farmer responded, Young man, all I know is that one day my dog and I were standing right here where we're standing today. We saw 4 shadowy figures crawl out. 3 women, and a man. And we tried to look and see their faces, but we couldn't see anything besides some sparkly white gleaming teeth. And that was it. Well, next thing I know, my dog turns around and starts running. And I didn't stop to think, I just ran after him. And we ran all the way back home. So now you best be staying away from that wishing well in that farm field. There's a fence there for a reason. Well, you can imagine, the rest of the boys were terrified. But Stanley, it only made him interested even more. So they all went back to camp, ate dinner, and went to bed. Well, the next morning, they woke up, and the teacher, Mr. Smith, took attendance. And wouldn't you know, one of the students was missing. Who do you think it was? Mr. Smith was angry. "Oh, who is it?" And one of the boys shouted out, "Mr. Smith, I think it's Stanley. Stanley's not here." Mr. Smith was angry, but also visibly nervous. Where do you think he could be, guys? Did anybody talk to him? Did anybody hear where he was going? One of the boys shouted out, "Well, Mr. Smith, we were up on that hill yesterday looking at the field, at the wishing well, and we saw this old farmer. And it looked like Stanley really wanted to go see what was in the wishing well." Mr. Smith cursed. He was like, "Darn that child!" And he was really angry. And he said, "Boys, come with me. Show me where this is." So the boys led Mr. Smith up to the top of the hill. And down below they could see a shadowy figure. There it was. It was Stanley Jenkins. And he was climbing over the fence into the abandoned field with the wishing well. Now, I don't know about you, but if one of you was doing that, I'd be yelling and screaming. And I hope our class would be too. So Mr. Smith ran down as fast as he could, yelling, "Stanley! Stanley Jenkins, get back here!" And he muttered to himself, "Why is that kid not listening?" But the students could see something that Mr. Smith could not. The students saw 4 shadowy figures crawling on their hands and knees in the direction that Stanley Jenkins was going. You see, Stanley was heading right for the well. It said that he wanted to make a wish, but you see, he never got there. For in a moment, one of the dark, shadowy figures grabbed him and pulled off his hood, and all Stanley could see was a bright, shining mouth with old, rickety teeth. It was part of a skull, and only hair was attached to it. Stanley began to scream. Mr. Smith heard it, and he got to the fence. But he could see what was happening. Something stopped him from going in. Mr. Smith couldn't go help him. The rest of the students could see what happened. The 4 shadowy figures lifted Stanley up and threw him into the well. Well, by the time the police got there, all they could find was Stanley's clothing. And that was it. At the bottom of the well. So many of the students left the school because they just couldn't bear that memory anymore. Mr. Smith stopped teaching. He felt horrible about what happened. But the legend says now that if you go out to that farm field at night, you will see 3 women, a man, and now a young boy.